Hello, and welcome to our Faith and Mental Health series. Today, we're going to be talking about Jesus and the wilderness and what the wilderness can mean for all of us, or at least our personal stories. We're going to be in Matthew 4, so if you want to open up your Bible or pull it up on the computer, you can.
Or if you're driving.
Please don't pull it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can just listen along. We're going to start with a question and then dive into the passage and then follow up with some Q&A.
Yeah, and this is our last episode of this season. And so hopefully you'll hear some themes of things pop back up as we read through this story together.
Exciting stuff. Okay, so the question of the day, our little icebreaker, is have you ever been lost, or specifically lost in the woods?
I have. I remember, so I'm from Chattanooga, and there's a lot of really wonderful hiking in Chattanooga. And I remember there's one hike in particular that I used to do all the time with friends. I think it was Rainbow Falls, maybe, up on Signal Mountain. And so on my way back up, I went off the trail thinking it was the trail or whatever.
Big mistake.
Yeah, but I've done that hike so many times. I'll be honest, I wasn't that scared because that hike in particular, it's like, some hikes like go around a mountain and like go up and down. And this one, I was like, I know I've just got to go up, and I've done it enough. I'd like hiked all the way down that mountain before, so it wasn't as freaky as it could be. But I definitely had to go through some like bushes and stuff I just like hiked all the way up the mountain until I got to the golf course that I knew was up at the top. I wasn't sure what was going to put me out at the top, but I knew eventually I would get out of the woods. So that one wasn't that bad. I got lost another time with some friends when I was in Spain, and I took a train and accidentally went like one or two stops too far. And I was trying to find La Sagrada Familia, which is like huge. So eventually, and I didn't have like cell phone service or whatever. And so I don't remember exactly how I found it. But eventually I was able to get like a glimpse of the top of it. And I just kind of tried to walk in that general direction and eventually found it. But I had enough time that day where I was like, if I have a couple hours like to play with here to be lost. And I knew enough Spanish that if I got in real trouble, I could figure something out. So I like stopped and I think got a coffee or like a pastry and then just kept going.
Man, yeah, there's a whole different level of being lost in another country you're unfamiliar with than...
Yeah, and what country and where you are, like...
Yeah, what language is the common language, and... Yeah, but this isn't my story, but I'm sure Daniel would be fine if I shared it. But he studied abroad in London, my husband, and he talks about getting lost on a bus because a lot of the like town names are to us look like Gloucestershire or whatever, and he was like, oh gosh, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to get off, because he was reading it wrong. And so he like asked the bus driver like, where is Gloucestershire? And the guy was like, oh, you mean Leicester Square? I don't know. It was something like that. I don't know the actual words, but like, it was like very much shortened. And so, anyway, that's not that great of a story.
Public transit can be kind of scary if you're not used to it, which I don't know. Nashville, we don't have great public transit, and I'm sure where Daniel's from, do not have that.
Yeah, small town Tennessee, no.
Yeah, so that definitely, I can get nervous if I'm on public transit. Like I think even with the train thing that I mentioned, I in some ways felt better once I got off.
Interesting.
Because it wasn't that, like, it was close enough.
Yeah, even if I'm navigating like the subway in New York, I am like so hyper aware of like, okay, one more stop, two more stop, like whatever. I'm like very like, I'm gonna pay attention like as much as possible because I'm not used to it. I'm also not good with directions at all.
So you've gotten lost.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not very outdoorsy, so like I feel like I recall like not figuring out where the trailhead, like when they mark it and sometimes it's not marked well. I feel like I've been in some situations like that, but nothing like, I definitely have never gone off trail or anything like that. But when I'm driving, I get lost a lot because I'm terrible with directions.
What's like the most you've ever gotten lost driving?
Well, there have been a lot of times, but I'm a millennial, so I still remember times where we didn't have GPS on our phones, which has been a game changer for me.
Yeah.
But one time I was coming back from college by myself, and I went to UT Knoxville, and so I was driving home to Nashville, and I got off on the wrong interstate, and I was going towards Chattanooga for like a large amount of time before I called my mom. I was like, I don't know where I am. And she was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing at that exit? And I was like, I don't know. So
That's funny.
Yeah, I added a lot to my trip there. And then I felt so stupid because I'm like, I should know this. It's because I'm not very good with visual memory. And so, like, if you tell me, I can remember perfectly what you've said, but, like, visually, like, it's what I'm bad with faces. I'm bad with, like, even driving around Nashville sometimes, I'm like, I don't recognize this. Even though I grew up here, like, it's bad.
That is funny.
But sometimes I do.
Yeah.
It just depends. But yeah, I've all that to say, I don't do well when I feel lost. I get sort of panicked. And then, of course, that makes things worse. But yeah, I usually end up now calling my husband because he's really good with directions and be like, where am I? What do I do?
That's funny.
Yeah. That's the problem with GPS is then you rely on them, and then when they, like, do weird stuff to be like, this will be 3 seconds faster, you're like, what is happening right now? And this doesn't feel right, But I don't know the right answer, so.
Sure. Or if you're, like, out of cell service or whatever, I'm sure that probably brings up a lot of anxiousness.
Unless I know where I'm going.
Yeah.
But yeah, like if it's something like I now can get from Nashville to Knoxville very easily.
Good. I'm glad. I'm glad.
I've driven it enough times, but.
That's funny.
And it's like a straight shot, so it's kind of hard to.
Yeah.
And I can get from Nashville to Chattanooga.
Yeah, I think for me sometimes, like, with getting lost or, like, not totally knowing where I am, it depends on how much time I have. So, like, I don't know. I think about, like, trying to find a cabin in Asheville or something. I'm just using that as an example. But oftentimes you go to one of these cabins in the mountains, and at some point you lose cell service.
Yes.
If you go and you're like, I have to be here by 6 o'clock, and you've only given yourself enough time to get there by 5:50, then that starts getting stressful. But if it's like, you know what, I just have to be here at some point, then it's not, I don't find it as stressful.
That made me think of where we all went for that family wedding
Oh yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
My mom was supposed to meet us there, and anyway, we went to this very rustic mountain, like a mountain.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
With like all of our different cabins were like along this road, but of course there was no self-service once you got there. And where our cabin was, like my mom and my husband and I were all staying in one, and it was like down in this like hole as soon as you got in there. But if you missed
a hobbit hole, if you will,
you would just go straight up the mountain where there was nowhere to turn around. And so like we were so far down in there that my mom had arrived later, and we were like waving like this, like, hey! Note for the audio, like I'm waving my arms up in the air.
Audio description. Yeah.
And we just see her just like go on up the mountain so quickly. And then I was like, I don't know what to do, because she could be anywhere on this mountain, and like there's no cell service. I can't call her and be like, hey, you completely missed us. Yeah, so 30 to 45 minutes later, we found her finally.
Gosh. Yeah, that can be stressful. But I think, for me, that idea of time with wilderness is helpful. because when I think about, and we'll talk about this after we read this passage, but like my own experiences in, a metaphorical wilderness, if you will, when I have this like sense of like really rushing to try to get out of it, the wilderness sometimes can be worse than when it's like, all right, I'm here. I won't be here forever, hopefully. But I have more like patience in it. The wilderness sometimes isn't as bad. Or sometimes I can even notice some like, oh, this is really pretty or nice out here, or whatever.
Maybe I can be spontaneous.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go slow. I'll park and go look around.
Or find something new.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's read this story from Matthew chapter 4 about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. And this is in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, after chapters 1, 2, and 3, if you're good with math. And it's immediately after Jesus is baptized. And it says in verse 16 of chapter 3, after his baptism, as Jesus came up out of the water, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and settling on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy." So this is before really Jesus' like earthly ministry that we know of gets started. And it says in chapter 4, verse 1, then Jesus was led by the Spirit, that Spirit that was descending like a dove, into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. During that time the devil came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus told him, "No, the scriptures say, people do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city, Jerusalem, to the highest point of the temple, and said, "If you are the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say, he will order his angels to protect you, and they will hold you up with their hands, and you won't even hurt your foot on a stone." Jesus responded, "The scriptures also say, you must not test the Lord your God." Next, the devil took him to the peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. "I will give it all to you," he said, "if you will kneel down and worship me." "Get out of here, Satan," Jesus told him, "for the scriptures say you must worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil went away, and the angels came and took care of Jesus. What jumps out to you in that initial reading? Is this story pretty familiar to you?
Yes, definitely familiar to me, but I feel like every time I read it, this is one of those that I notice something a little different. But what I was noticing is in the last, verse 9 and following, we're at the last sort of temptation, where Satan is saying, like, all these I will give to you if you fall down and worship me. And, like, this temptation, that has always seemed weird to me, that, like, Satan's like, look what I can do. Because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a scary amount. I don't, what level of authority does he have to, like, actually
Sure.
Play this out? But I was just noticing how quickly Jesus says, "Be gone from me." And I wonder if part of it is because of how familiar he is with the Father. And, like, how much respect and love he has for his authority in that relationship. Because he knows more than any of us, right? Because he has descended from the Father and will go back to the Father. And so I'm like, we so quickly forget as humans what our relationship with God is, and, like, how God wants to delight in us and have, a good relationship with us and wants our good. And Jesus, like, did not forget that in that moment. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it is. That's good. Yeah, I mean, that we quickly forget, and reminded of, is you're saying that this, because I thought that too, I will give it all to you. It's like, what authority does this dude have? But so our church is reading through the Bible in 2 years and reading some New Testament, Old Testament. And we're in the Gospel of John. And in John 14, Jesus says, "I don't have much more time to talk to you because the ruler of this world approaches. He has no power over me. But I will do what the Father requires of me so that the world will know that I love the Father. Come, let's be going. And so I'm seeing those things that you're saying, of like that love for the Father, but also like the enemy does have power.
Yeah.
And Jesus doesn't critique him there, at least, on like whether or not he's right. Because Jesus also knows like he's actually the one who's like ultimately authority. But let's talk about too, I guess, important as we're talking about the wilderness. What does the wilderness represent to you, or what do you think of when you think of the wilderness, metaphorically speaking?
So I think for me, typically, the wilderness I think of is actually more like the Israelite wilderness, and how they are given this promise in the promised land. And so, like, wandering in the wilderness until you get to your promised land, to me, has been like has helped me through really hard times, because there's so many times where, and I imagine it would be like this. I hesitate to put like myself in the mindset of Jesus. I actually have no idea what he was feeling in these 40 days, but I would feel lonely. I would feel like, what's, the end here, and what's the purpose? And I think for me, a wilderness is sort of like this idea that like it's wild. It's unpredictable.
The wilderness.
Yeah.
If you will.
It's in the word, right?
Yeah. That's interesting.
Unpredictable is what I think of. I think of like potential dangers in wilderness. I think of like an expanse of space and time that's unknown for you. So like if I'm walking through a wilderness period in my life, I don't get to know when it's going to end or when I will come on to the other side to the metaphorical promised land, is often how I've thought about it.
Yeah. Mark's account of this in Mark chapter 1, verse 13 says that this is where he was tempted by Satan for 40 days. He was out among the wild animals, and angels took care of him. So yeah, there is this element of like wildness there, untamed. Yeah, I think of the Israelite story too, and this like they're led out of slavery, and they're being led into the promised land. But this time period in between where you were and where you are going to be. And so it's a place of like uncertainty. And even the language in here is interesting. Like it says for 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. 40 in the Bible is a number that is representative of a lot of different things. So we see like Noah's Ark, right? That it rained or was it raining for 40 days and 40 nights? Is that correct?
I think so.
And then we see with the Israelites, they were in the wilderness for 40 years, which denoted like a passing of a generation. It was a longer period of time. We see Elijah, when he encounters God and goes in this cave and prays basically a suicidal prayer. He is given enough food to go for like 40 days, basically. It signifies like a passing of time. Is it a specific number? Perhaps. I think, here I probably tend to think, yeah, why not? But I think the bigger thing is it's like this like chunk of time, like it rained for a while, or he was there for a while, or 40 years, like a passing of a generation, or there's a number of kings that were just listed kind of generically, if you will, as reigning for 40 years. Jesus, the time between his resurrection and his ascension was 40 days. There's a lot of like 40 parallels there. And so I think with this idea of wilderness too, that Jesus was there for 40 days in contrast with the Israelites who were there for 40 years, we're already seeing this parallel there, where Jesus was there for a period of time as the Israelites were there for a period of time. And interestingly, too, I read the baptism story partially because if you are familiar with the story of the Exodus, when the Israelites were led out of slavery in Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea. They went through the waters. And here Jesus goes through the waters and is led into the wilderness. Contrary to them, where they were, super worried about food and super, like caring about who was going to be their king and eventually wanting authority of their own, or that story where Moses goes up on the top of the mountain and comes down and the Israelites are worshiping the golden calf. Jesus here, does what Israel failed to do and doesn't succumb to any of those same temptations, which is really, really beautiful. There's other parallels with Elijah. There's other parallels with Adam, even where the first man and woman are in a garden, a luscious, beautiful garden, and are tempted with this food. And here Jesus is not in a luscious garden. Here he is in the wilderness fasting, and he doesn't give in to the same temptation.
Yeah.
Which is really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from what I know of Matthew and how he presents the gospel account, a lot of what he is doing is showing you how Jesus is redeeming what came before,
Mm-hmm.
and how he is the perfect person who can actually do what the Israelites and Adam and Eve before him were called to do. But in their humanness, they ultimately failed. So I do think it's really cool to think about the parallels of Jesus being there for 40 days and the 40 years that the Israelites walked in the wilderness, this time of testing,
Mm-hmm.
and really a call to obedience. And it's so heartbreaking and hard to read the story of the Israelites and see the entire Old Testament is just filled with failure after failure after failure after failure, even though God is here's what I'm promising to you, and his promises are amazing.
Sure.
I'm wow, I want that promise, of just earthly blessings and so much stuff, and it still isn't enough to motivate the obedience. And so I also with our own wilderness, this call to obedience in the midst of wilderness is really, really hard. And I think it does show your true character and how stable your faith is in the midst of those times.
Guys, you're talking Hebrews 12 comes to mind, which talks about being surrounded by a huge crowd of witnesses. And it says, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. Now he's seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. And so I think with part of what you're saying too is earlier when you said Jesus, having this intimate relationship with the Father, knows deeply in the core of his being, this is temporary. This won't last. Similarly, what we were talking about earlier with even being lost. If eventually you're gonna get out, it's not as freaky or scary. When you have that patience in knowing what's to come, it doesn't change that you're lost. It doesn't change a lot of the things that you're experiencing in there. But yeah, I'm reminded of Psalms, reminded of other places that are how long will you forget me? How long am I going to be here? And ironically, some of them wanting to be out so quickly and going about it their own way led to them being there longer for the Israelites. Yeah, which is kind of scary. Let's talk about, I just want to hit on this really quickly. This notion of him fasting and becoming very hungry. So for a long time, I think for me, when I would read this, I was man, I guess I just associate being hungry with feeling weak. which not all of that's wrong, but I was like, oh man, that had to be hard, when he was tempted with these things. But thinking about it again now I feel like a better, more experiential knowledge of fasting, Jesus would have been pulling from a deeper strength than food at that point when he was tempted. And so where the devil says, if you are the son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread. And Jesus repeats scripture back to him. I used to be like, man, it still is impressive and beautiful, and he's God and all that kind of stuff. But I'm also like, that's part of what even the beauty and things like fasting and other practices actually help you to be able to do is I don't know. I think of things in my own life, or times when I've fasted or whatever, when I feel tempted to do something or whatever. And it's like, well, I'm already really committed at this point. I'm not backing down now. You know what I mean? I'm really in.
Yeah, I know you've had that experience with fasting. I can't say that I'm there yet, but
Hey, that's fine.
I do think, when I think, okay, sorry, brain, focus your thoughts. Okay, so what I think about the longer you go without food, the less you feel like you need it in a lot of ways. Those first couple of days are the hardest, depending on how long. I've never fasted for 40 days, but I've tried 3 days or 5 days. And the first day is so hard, and your body just feels all of the withdrawal of nutrients, but I think it's also probably just processing through whatever the last thing is that you've eaten. But then the longer you go, the more you're I don't feel that pang of hunger as much.
Interesting.
I don't know. Maybe that's been my experience.
Yeah, I found for me, I've generally done short. My more regular rhythm is short fasting. But when I've did not that long ago one that was longer, I think on the front end of fasting, and I'm saying fasting is a practice, but also I don't know, it could be other things of being in the wilderness or whatever. Not that fasting is totally wilderness, but I sometimes the desire for food sometimes could get me without thinking about it. What I have to watch out for is not even as much of I'm hungry, I'm going to go and grab food. It's I'm hungry, I grabbed food and I didn't even think about it. But the longer you go, the more, even if you're hungry and start actually feeling physically weak and mental capacities might not be as totally strong as they were, multiple days back. What I've noticed, at least in me, is that over time of doing that practice regularly, I'm able to break down some of those automaticities or those things that I automatically do without thinking. And so instead of I'm hungry, I eat. It's I'm hungry, I notice that I'm hungry, notice that I desire something, and then later I'm oh yeah, I could eat. I could grab something. And so I think part of taking it back to the wilderness thing, at least for me, part of what the wilderness does is it really illuminates the things that you really want and desire. And sometimes in the wilderness, unlike in other places, you're not able to get the things that you want. So for me, if a wilderness period was a long period of intense depression, right? I want to feel good. And other times I might have been able to go find vices or find other things, some good, some awful and sinful and bad, to make me feel better. But in the wilderness, I can't go to those things. And so what it does is it really illuminates a desire within me for something else. And that's where I feel in the wilderness, you have the opportunity to learn people do not live by bread alone. Because I've been trying to get my bread. And I can't get my bread. And this other bread is this manna stuff that's coming from the clouds. And it's beautiful that God does that. But they wanted more things, right? So
Yeah.
from my remembrance of the story.
Yeah, I wonder in this story, I think, Jesus has this ability to do things perfectly. And so, but his communing with the Father has certainly strengthened him in this fasting period. Right, this is like the first thing he does before he starts his earthly ministry. And so, like, I think for me, what I take from that is like, even if what I desire is what I feel called to, or I feel like God is calling me into, my instinct is to go, I'm going to immediately jump into it and I'm going to know what to do. But like sometimes the wilderness can actually be like, no, you can't have this thing yet, but I'm going to equip you, and then you will be tested.
Yeah.
And then you'll have some version of this that you probably did not expect. But
yeah,
that's really what it turns out to be. And I feel that way a lot with my ministry experience, actually. Through lots of things that I won't necessarily share here, but I felt the calling long before I was equipped and tested to be able to even step into a version of that calling.
Yeah, or like before, you had the opportunity to be able to, because I imagine the Lord was equipping you in that meantime wilderness period, and you're like the leader that you are. Not that anyone wished the wilderness upon you, but like largely because of that, like that.
I would be a very different leader
like,
had I not walked through that.
Knowing you and what you're passionate about and the way you seek to try to raise other people up and like give people opportunities to lead and all that kind of stuff, like very much seems to be something that the Lord formed within you.
Yeah. And I still was faced with that choice of like, like it's really hard. And I'm talking about vocational ministry. And I think we all as Christ followers are given a ministry. So let me just preface that. Like we are all supposed to be ministering. But yeah, it's really, for me, it was a lot of like, do I trust God enough to be able to continue to pursue this, even while I'm watching other people, like my friends, have like these earthly treasures, right? Like, oh, you're pursuing a different field and you're very successful in that field. And like success in vocational ministry is very different than success in anything else. And not that those things are bad for other people. It's just so hard not to feel like that's what I was pursuing. And so it's just, yeah, I think that ultimate question is like, do we trust that what God has for us is good and that there's a purpose for the wilderness? Or do we just say like, this wilderness is hard, I'm going to wallow and I'm going to backtrack, and then I'm going to like, ultimately, I mean, you could walk away from your faith.
Yeah. I'm reminded of this quote that's from Ruth Haley Barton in her book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. And she was writing concerning Moses. She said, Moses discovered what we all must discover, that solitude is the place of our own conversion. And she's talking in here about wilderness. She said, in solitude, we stop believing our own press. We discover that we are not as good as we thought, but we are also more than we thought. And then she goes on to say, in solitude, our illusions fall away and we see, sometimes with disturbing clarity, our competitiveness, our jealousies, our rage, our manipulations. We get in touch with our fears of loneliness and abandonment, fears of really loving and allowing others to love us, fears of our sexuality and how powerful it is in combination with our spirituality. When we're in the company of others, it's easier to project our fears and negative feelings onto them. When we're in solitude, we must claim these inner experiences as our own. We discover that we are not who we thought we were, and all of our self-aggrandizement, hopefully I pronounced that right.
Aggrandized?
Aggrandizement?
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that how you say that?
Yeah.
Aggrandizement. Okay. nor are we who other people think we are in all of their idealized projections. We come in contact more with who we really are, both of our like sinfulness and sin patterns, but also with how deeply we are loved. And so Jesus here going into the wilderness before entering into the ministry, it's beautiful because it tells me wilderness and long periods of wilderness, whether the Spirit of God led you in there, circumstances did, or God, you're just there, whatever may not have the reason why you're there, is not a disqualifying of you for ministry. It actually might be the preparation for you for ministry. I'm not saying it's fun.
No.
But I think it's certainly true. I love Jesus more, and this might not be everybody's experience, but like I love Jesus more and am closer to him and rely on him more because of long periods of wilderness. When there's some quote, I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but something like that you don't realize Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. And I've certainly found that to be true. And when you come out of a wilderness season, you're able to notice the flourishing that there is in the beauty and the good and the wonder, and all those things become a lot richer than if you've always been in a garden.
Yeah, I think it's really hard because, I mean, first of all, Jesus is man of sorrows, and so he goes through a lot of suffering, which I think a lot of times your wilderness periods are suffering periods. And I think, we've been to a lot of things where John Mark Comer has spoken, and he talks about suffering being the only avenue he knows of to make you into a person of love.
Yep.
And I think on the last podcast, we even talked about like the word compassion and how it means like being with someone in pain, like with pain.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that we all have the choice to be obedient or disobedient in that wilderness time. And I think you will become whichever choice you go with in that time. It's not that we won't all have wilderness periods, because you will. Like, that is just part of being human. And you could argue that we just all went through a global wilderness period, right? And I think we saw a lot of testing of character and a lot of, like, fleshing out what do I actually believe about what I deserve and what I need and what I want. And this, like, illusion of control that we all think that we have gets vastly tested in periods of wilderness. And we don't have control, and so it makes you feel out of control. When you feel out of control, you cling to something that will make you feel like you have control, typically.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard, and I think it's a daily choice as well. I don't think it's like, now I'm humble and I walk everywhere with hands open. Like, no, I don't want to go through another period of wilderness. Like, I'm like, I did it. I made it, Lord. Like, we're good, right?
And it will come again.
Yeah. And in some sense, like, does it ever end here?
Yeah.
There's always, like, this lingering wilderness, I think, that's there.
Like, I almost wonder, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, thinking of the imagery in the beginning of the Bible, right, where God spoke order into chaos and then placed humankind in this Garden of Eden, and they're kicked out of the garden because of their own sin, their own choices. And then after that, we start seeing a lot of wilderness. And then eventually in Revelation, we see this new sort of imagery, again, of like a new garden, new city, new heavens, new earth, where there's no more pain, no more suffering, no more any of those types of things. And so there, I think, is a very holy and good response in the midst of wilderness to realize and recognize this is not all that God has for this place. And so there's that side. But there is also the side that is like, he is doing more, wants to do more, and will do more. And so part of the journey of walking in the wilderness is holding these tensions and knowing we're human, and sometimes we're going to lean one way or the other. Some people might lean towards looking forward to the future so much that it ends up being kind of in denial of what's actually going on. Well, sometimes that's a coping mechanism, and sometimes you just need to, keep going. And then other times we can lend towards like bitterness and like this will always be the case, and certainly it feels like that. And so I think part of the tension is, how do we in wilderness hold both the immense pain and suffering and the dryness, the lack of flourishing that is here, that is not fully like all that God is going to do, while also hoping and looking forward to when he will do more, and partnering with him. There's a lot of like gardening imagery that Jesus uses, like in planting seeds, and leading towards flourishing, to enacting his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. How do we, partner with God in that weird sort of space, both in mourning what is, looking forward to what's coming, partnering with him and bringing that forth, also meeting people in the midst of suffering, also planting seeds, but not knowing which ones are going to turn into weeds or like fail, or which ones are going to grow. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really easy to think about life in dualities. And it's tempting to. Like, it's either all good or it's all bad.
Yeah.
Everything will be great. Nothing has been since. Those type of mindsets are, I think, dangerous. I think we are more complex than that. I think definitely God is more complex than that. And I feel like our earth and our world is more complex than that. And so I think it's easy to be like, wilderness is all bad, and one day I'll get to the point where it's good again. But even in wilderness, there is goodness, and there is mercy, and there is beauty, and there is joy, and delight. Those things don't go away, even if they look different for a season, depending on what you're going through. And so I think it is, the older I get, the more it is about learning to hold all of it instead of it being one or the other. And that's hard.
Yeah, it is.
It's a lot harder than, it's easier to say that than it is to like actually live that. But there are moments every day where you're disappointed in a relationship that you have, or you're hurt by your friend, or your spouse, or your boyfriend or girlfriend, or your parent, or your child. Like, there are just, I think relationally particularly, there's a lot of, you can see that play out in a way that I feel like is a good example. Like, just because someone fails you, like, there's a love that overcomes that failure and causes you to keep going back to that relationship. And I think that plays out in a lot of ways in the wilderness of life as well. And so I think we have to just like be eyes open, ready to receive and to see, because this silence that we're talking about, this like sort of like introspection, and also like, I don't think extrospection is a word, but like, like an internal thing, and then an external, like, what do I also see?
Sure. Yeah.
Because it's so easy to block out everything else when you're in those periods as well. I think, or like distract yourself from them. And so like, I'm just thinking like particularly like when I was going through like my dad being super sick, and everything felt like death every day. I clung to who God said he was. And I still don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. And I hate it. But during that time, there was like a strength in me that was not of my own, that I don't know that I still necessarily have, or at least I don't have to access it as much every day as I did during that time. But like when I spoke about scripture, when I spoke about Jesus, there was more of a power to it than any other time in my life, which is very odd to me. And I don't understand it fully, but it's like that wilderness also produced like immense fruit. And it caused me to grow in ways that like I didn't want to grow as a 27-year-old or 28-year-old. Like,
yeah, of course.
I never imagined having to grow in those ways at that time in my life, but I did. And I think I'm a much more, I don't know, I'm more rough around the edges than I was before. I'm more like likely to cuss or like say things how it is, or to just call something out and be like, that's dumb, than I ever was before. But I also think like the authenticity that it created in me as a person to become a more holistic person, I don't know that would have happened otherwise. And I'm not saying that I would wish that ever happening again. I don't even know if that's worth it to me, but I didn't get to choose it. So, you know, I don't speak about that often publicly, but I don't talk a lot about what that was actually like. Because I think for me, people are afraid of that level of pain, and they're afraid of that level of like what's in me as a person. And so I like dull those edges for people. Because especially at our age, a lot of people haven't been through that level of pain. And it does something to you. And I like walk with a limp now, I guess. But like that limp allows me to like see other people's limps and to like love them more in their limp and try not to fix it, and to just be like, whatever you're doing, keep going. Like, you know, I don't know if any of that made any sense, but
it did. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing those things.
Yeah. So I think even here, this fasting, like, yes, it's very much food, what we're talking about with fasting, but
sometimes it's forced.
Sometimes it's a forced fasting of deprivation of things that are like on your hierarchy of needs. And Jesus will fill in those areas, but there's still a hole that's like missing at the same time.
You said something earlier that I want to draw back on. You mentioned this idea of introspection and the new word, which is extrospection.
Extrospection.
Do you think that you have to do introspection before you can really do extrospection? I'm just going to roll with that word.
I like it. Let's add it to the dictionary.
You hear that, Oxford?
I think yes. To do it well, yes. I think a lot of us walk around and don't know ourselves. And if you don't know yourself, then how can you possibly know a relational God? How can you possibly know the intricacies of what it means to be human?
Yeah, and if you don't know yourself too, part of it is you don't realize what filters and what things you're bringing to other people or to God.
Yeah.
Not that we ever, like this side of eternity, fully know, but sometimes you hear people say things about someone else or about God, and you start hearing their story, and you're like, oh, this is like, it's directly paralleled. I'm not meaning that in a bad way, but I was reminded of this quote from A.J. Swoboda in his book After Doubt, and he's talking particularly about depression. And I resonated a lot with this, with my experience with depression. That he said humans have an incredible capacity to avoid looking reality in the face. And he goes on to talk about this woman named Catherine Schultz, who did groundbreaking research on depression, who wrote about how depressed individuals seems to exhibit a greater capacity to deal with reality in a more honest and truthful way than those who live in the illusion of constant happiness and success. She pointed out countless studies that have shown that people who suffer from depression have a more accurate worldview than non-depressed people, because depressed people don't nurture the cheering illusion that they can control the course of their lives. That outlook is known as depressive realism. She suggests actually that happiness, or our happiness, can shield us from reality rather than wanting to see reality for what it is. We protect our happiness at all costs. And once again, wilderness stuff is like not something that you like, I don't know, it's not a fun thing to go through, but it also is necessary. And Jesus did that before going into like his earthly ministry, that like this is how we're formed and shaped. And I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but something to the extent of that oftentimes the thing that has caused us the most pain is like can be our greatest contribution to the world. And I think that goes in line with it was Paul who talked about like Christ's power being made perfect in weakness and boasting all the more gladly or whatever in our weakness. Not that it's easy, not that we wish it upon anybody, but I think that introspection realism piece is really important. It also makes the good things a whole lot sweeter. Like that's a beautiful thing that I didn't, when I was really in the depths, I didn't know that was ever going to come.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about is just honesty.
Yeah, it is.
Because I think we can all delude
a much more
ourselves.
succinct way to say what I just said. So
yeah, well, I mean, anyway. It's hard to be honest with yourself about your dark places, about places where maybe you haven't repaired pain that has happened to you and now you're repeating that cycle. That is some hard stuff, especially depending on your background and the level of things that you have gone through. But if we deny those parts of ourselves, you will become even more of a shell of yourself the older you get. And I think you'll become resentful and bitter. Even if you still are projecting this level of like, I'm happy all the time. Because you're not. And so denying parts of yourself is never good. It will come out somehow, whether or not you face it directly or not. Like whatever you're denying will come out sideways somehow.
Sure, will leak out.
Yeah.
You've got to deal with it.
Yeah.
You've got to face it head on. And going back to that thing we were talking about earlier too, even with the wilderness, sometimes just by trying to get out of it, you're forcing yourself, and ironically, to be in it longer, as opposed to walking in it and through it for all that it is worth.
Yeah, and I think we have to be honest too about what Jesus is actually offering.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us aren't. And so we're really reconciling that in the church right now, in the American church, I will say, is like, if we project it as like happiness and prosperity and like Jesus will give you whatever your heart desires and like he wants only the best for you, like those are like twisting truths.
At least incomplete.
Yeah, it's incomplete because that's not even what we're seeing in this one passage. That's even before he started his ministry, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, again, we have to be honest inwardly and honest about what it is Jesus has to offer. And you said this in your sermon when we were talking about the way, the truth, and the life. Like, Jesus is the way to the Father. He's not the way to everything. He's the way to a very specific thing.
Yes.
And if you're not looking for that one specific thing, then he's not the way for you.
Yeah, if you want to be the boss or king of your own life, or like not deal with your sin or whatever, like he's not, he is wanting to also internally in that wilderness within you, that untamed wild beast, all that stuff, wanting to convict, to change, to bring flourishing, to allow the dead things to die, and to bring life out of it. As John 15 talks about, also prune you immensely.
Yeah. And that's what you do if you are a gardener of any kind. Like, you prune back the dead parts so that your plant can flourish.
Yeah, even the good parts sometimes.
Yeah.
For vines in particular.
I'm thinking particularly of my hydrangeas.
Oh, nice.
My new house. But like...
Yeah. I'm preaching on the vine this week, so I'm thinking of the vine.
Yeah,
branches.
absolutely. But you prune it so that it will grow more, and so that it will... it will flourish.
I want to say with vines and branches. So in John 15, Jesus says, I'm the vine, you're the branches, my Father's the gardener, vine dresser. If you look online, I think if I remember correctly, it's every year, like you prune back of the branches somewhere between like 80 and 90%, including the good ones, so that it can grow.
Yeah.
So there be a lot of pruning that needs to happen in my life still. Even though I've walked through wilderness, I am confident I will walk through it again. And arguably, like you said earlier, I mean, are we ever like totally out? There is this interesting tradition in like a rabbinic tradition. So like that talks about Moses encountering the burning bush in Exodus, where God reveals himself to him as I am. And there's this tradition that says that the bush was burning for a while and other people must have walked by. And I mean, it's not necessarily in the text, but it's a thought and tradition. Other people must have walked by without noticing. And so how much of our lives are we also so consumed just with ourselves, or protecting and guarding and shielding our own happiness, our own whatever thing that you put around it, that we actually miss what God is doing, perhaps even in the wilderness, and often in the wilderness, where he is showing up and bringing forth life or revealing himself in a powerful way. How often do we just miss it? Because we're like, it's not real, it's not real, it's not real. But over here is a burning bush from God declaring who he is in a powerful way. That open your eyes. There's a correlation between paying attention and seeing.
Yeah, and even on a smaller scale, like your daily bread. Like, he was giving them every day daily bread. And that's what I think about now, is like how to live presently, and like every day to be like, what is my daily bread for today? Because he offers it, and we do miss it. We miss the burning bush. We miss the manna. We miss the promised land. We miss a lot of things when we refuse to live in reality.
And I wonder, I mean, I think this is maybe a human problem, but I know for us in the West, and I'll just say for me.
Yeah, we're speaking from our very limited experiences.
But people, maybe now more than ever, I don't know, but like have a desire for instant gratification. So to get what I want right now, because in a lot of ways, that's what's being formed and shaped into us, particularly through media, that we can't actually get what we want when we want it. In some ways, that's tied in with the American dream. I mean, it's very like embedded into our DNA. But I think about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience. We don't like that one. That's the joke. Don't pray for patience, because the Lord will give you opportunities to be patient. But if you want to become a person of love, a person who God has created you to be, you have to develop in patience. And this goes true with the wilderness thing too, that we want this like fullness of everything right now. But God does promise, like Jesus is going to return and make all things new. There'll be no more, he'll wipe away every tear from our eyes. Like that's what Revelation chapter 21 says. But in the meantime, if we are not patient, we actually can fail to see what God is doing now. And if there actually is like a way in which we can access this like eternal life and beauty and wonder and paradise that God is making now.
Yeah, and there's a slowness that has to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we have to enter into slowness, because if we're so hurried and busied all the time, which is also a huge part of our culture, like we miss, you can't possibly sit and think and have time to like introspect, extrospect, anything if you're constantly going. And so like to be a person of love, I think you have to slow and be present with the people around you as well.
Yeah, I think too, like one of the things the wilderness really does, once again, is it reveals what your heart, or at least part of your heart, really desires. Henry Nouwen, in his book, In the Name of Jesus, lists 3 temptations that Jesus faced here. One was to be relevant, or to turn stones into bread. Another one was to be popular or spectacular. Another one was to be powerful, which is where the devil takes him to a high mountain. And I think in the wilderness, we're confronted with all of these things. Like the need to do enough, or to be enough, to be relevant, as opposed to, it comes right after Jesus' baptism. This is my dearly beloved son, with whom I am well pleased. That if we follow Jesus, that's what's true about us. It's not about what I offer to the world. It's who he says, or it's who he is, and then who he says I am. And then going on to be popular, right? Like that it's not about just what other people think about me. In the wilderness, I come to terms with what really is the most true thing about me is what God says. I might listen to other voices there, but that's what the wilderness, I think, can teach us. And same with to be powerful, because there you feel really darn weak. And you realize that maybe you don't even care if you are that powerful. You just want him to sustain you, to be your strength, because that's what you need.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this season of our podcast, this is the last epi of this episode of this season. Do you have any thoughts that you would like to share as we wrap up concerning faith, mental health, something you've learned or that stood out to you?
I think in this lasting idea of slowness, like be patient with yourself and be patient with the journey that it takes, and don't rush it, because you'll miss it if you do rush it. But also like it takes a long time to unpack how complex we are as humans, and so these elements of us that are unseen by the human eye, I guess, take time and effort and real intentionality to dig into, and wrestling and beauty and pain, and it's all of it. And so we are very much still in the journey. I mean, I don't think I've learned everything I need to learn at 31 years old.
Which is good to admit.
Yeah, I hope there's more for me than just right now. You know, I hope that I continue to grow and be sanctified and look more and more like a person of love and who Jesus modeled for us to be. But it's been an absolute joy to even get to share in this way and talk in this way, and to produce this season. So, yeah, I'm excited to see what's next and to continue in this journey. And I hope you feel seen. I hope you feel loved. I hope that you feel valued, because you are. So.
Well said. Yeah. That's really good. Talking about faith and mental health is a big passion of ours, largely because of our own wilderness experiences. And so we hope and pray that as some fellow journeyers, this has been helpful. We plan to release another season come spring. If you have particular questions concerning faith and mental health, pain, emotions, social media, and that, I mean, whatever, like, let us know. We would love to not answer them necessarily, but respond and maybe spur some good questioning for you. But we hope that this has been helpful. And if you don't have a good, solid community of people to talk with, we hope and pray that you can find that. And if we can be of any assistance to you whatsoever in that process, please let us know. May God bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance towards you and give you peace. Amen.